Thank you so much, Mark, for that very generous and kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us and being here this afternoon. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be back in Minneapolis. I was here a couple of years ago and had a great visit, and it's always refreshing to leave Washington, not only because there's less humidity, but there's also less, let's say, noise, political noise, than there is here. So that for me, it's great. And I want to just commend the Global Minnesota for all of its excellent work, and it really is fantastic what you do, and congratulations for your programs, which are really, really terrific. And I'm honored to be part of it. And also thank you very much for organizing the State Fair for tomorrow to coincide with my visit. It's very thoughtful of all of you to do that. I was in Mexico City last week, and we launched the Spanish version of this book that came out just a couple of months ago called Unfulfilled Promises, Latin America Today. We had also released the Portuguese version in Rio de Janeiro about a month and a half ago. And all of those, both in Portuguese, English, and Spanish, are all online, available to anybody who wants them. But we had a very good presentation in Mexico, and a very good discussion. And the first question that somebody asked, who's a former ambassador at the session, was, does it really make sense to use the word Latin America? Is that still a useful term, a useful category? And it made a lot of people think. It made me think. A lot of people who participated in the discussion think of what really holds this region together. And of course, there's language, and there's some culture and background and history. But increasingly, it is true, and I think this was the point of the ambassador, that the differences among the countries in this Latin America are getting wider and sharper. So to talk about Venezuela, which is an unmitigated disaster, one of the worst disasters I think we've ever seen in this hemisphere, and Chile, which is a country that's doing pretty well, or Costa Rica or Uruguay, are really, to put them in the same sort of Latin America label, perhaps really obscures the vast differences and profound differences that I think are getting, because of globalization, I think are getting wider, not narrower over time. So as I speak about Latin America, I want to just sort of make that caveat from the beginning for people to call people's attention to differences, wide differences among the countries. This book that was published a couple of months ago and was an attempt of the InterAmerican Dialogue. We have lots of reports on corruption and energy and climate change and the role of China in Latin America and education in Latin America. We work in a lot of different areas, but we really wanted to step back and take stock of the region and find the best Latin American analysts to talk about 6 salient themes on the agenda, which I think are fairly common to most countries in the region. The first is democracy and the rule of law. The second is criminal violence, which is a big problem and big challenge in many countries in the region. The third is poverty, inequality, the social issue. The fourth is economic growth and economic management. The fifth is integration. How well do these countries work together with each other? And the sixth is Latin America and the world. How does this region deal with the world? The United States, China, the European Union, and the like, because those are also a very complex set of relationships. So those are the 6 essays, and the attempt really was to say, okay, what's the background on each of these issues? Where are we today, and where does the region seem to be headed? We have an excellent introduction by my boss, who's former president of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, who's the co-chair of the InterAmerican Dialogue, and wrote an excellent introduction that I think reflects the kind of what this title suggests, which is that there have been moments of great expectations and great hopes in Latin America, but there seem to be followed by a lot of frustration a lot of disappointment, and a lot of setbacks. And so it's a region, I think more than other regions, that tends to have these cycles where things seem to look very promising and then don't quite work out, don't quite fulfill the promise that they make. And her introduction, if you read it, is a very, very hard, honest reflection, I think, of the inability of the region to really make progress on a lot of fronts. And you could look at all of the issues I just mentioned. Democracy, we had the end of the Cold War, we had transitions to democracy, we used to have military governments in Latin America, but there was a hope that with democracy you would have stronger institutions, the rule of law, the judiciary would be stronger, lots of other things would be strong that would come along with that. Well, some of that's happened, but not quite what people expected in the early 1990s, when there was a moment of great hope and expectations. Latin America is the most peaceful region in the world. There are no wars among countries at all, which is good, but at the same time, it has the highest levels of violence, criminal violence in the world. How do you understand that? So there's been some progress on some issues, some not. There were moments when, which I'll talk about in a second, when poverty and inequality have come down, but now we're at a moment of stagnation. So again, the expectation and the hope with that poverty reduction would continue, and the region would improve, and now that's kind of at a stage. Latin America has had no shortage of regional organizations. There's been a proliferation of regional organizations, attempts for countries in South America and in all of Latin America to work together on economic and political issues. But yet there's been a failure to really create sustainable, effective regional institutions. And so there's this hope of people working together, but somehow there are real obstacles and problems, lack of trust, lack of resources, whatever it happens to be, to make these very, very strong, effective institutions. So each of these chapters, in a way, comes up with the same conclusion, which is that, there has been some progress, the high hopes, and then followed by some frustration. And the common theme is the lack of real capacity of institutions and governments to be effective in reducing poverty, in reducing crime and violence, in tackling problems together, in managing the economies in ways that make sense for the longer term, and also dealing with the world effectively, dealing with the United States effectively, and dealing with China effectively, two of the countries that have the greatest impact in Latin America. So I think we're at a moment in this cycles that I referred to where we're at a bit of a challenging moment now in Latin America. There's the region is barely growing. It's a little less than 1% average growth. And of course, if you add in that Venezuela, that includes Venezuela. If you take out Venezuela, it gets a little bit better, but not much better. Venezuela is the outlier. Because it really is, if you look at the numbers of inflation and the loss of GDP in the last couple of years, it's just really stunning and dramatic, and I think unprecedented by knowledge in the history of Latin America. And the political trends are not encouraging as well. We have new leaders in a number of countries I'll talk about in a second, but they tend to be having difficult times because they have low growth, because they don't have resources, and because they have political problems, governance problems, and the like. So the lack of strong institutions and weak growth presents a real problem. Now, if I'd been making this talk 10 years ago, a decade ago, in 2009, I'd be telling a very different story. From 2003 to 2013, Latin America did grow at a sustained rate of about 5% over that time. Commodity prices were high. Latin America is very rich in commodities, in copper, in oil, in natural gas, in iron ore, and soybeans. And those prices were very, very high. So they did very, very well. China was a great consumer and was buying a lot of commodities from Latin America. That increased growth rates, and with that increased growth rates and resources, poverty went down. significantly in a number of countries in that time period, and even inequality, which is sort of the Achilles heel of Latin America, also was reduced. New governments came in, but the new governments after that period have really struggled to perform well. One of the ways to look at Latin America that is common in the media today is to look at Latin America. Are we going right? Or are we going left? Sort of the pendulum idea. I've always been a little skeptical of that, and I think Latin Americans, if you look at poll numbers, are mainly in the center. Sometimes center left, sometimes center right, but the vast overwhelming majority of Latin Americans are basically concentrated in the center. But the problem is that there are high demands, high expectations, less tolerance for things like corruption than there were in the past. In this period from 2003 to 2013, when things got a lot better, that people joined the middle class and wanted to buy more and had higher demands for better public services and the like. And now, after the party's over, new governments come in and say, okay, what are you going to deliver or not? So I think it's more useful and productive to look at these changes in terms of effectiveness of government and performance. And if governments don't perform well, whether they are of the right or of the left, they're going to be punished at the polls. And the good thing is that in Latin America, there are elections that matter and that do take place. That was not always the case, and one should bear that in mind. And the legitimacy of democracy and these political systems are very much connected to their capacity to deliver results and to perform well. We've seen a lot of surprises in the region recently, and we're going to go through a number of them to illustrate the point. We had a big surprise in this country. I think it was a surprise for many people in 2016 with the elections. And let me go through some surprises in Latin America. The most recent one was in Argentina, where it's the third largest economy in Latin America. 2 years ago, the government of Mauricio Macri won overwhelmingly in regional and local elections, seemed to have broad support for a state market-oriented economy, pro-globalization, trying to correct the excesses in government intervention of the past. And Macri said to the Argentines when he came in, he says, judge me on whether I was able to reduce inflation and reduce poverty. Well, last Sunday they did that, and he didn't come out too well. He lost by 15 points. This, of course, I should stress is a primary. It's not even the election, but it is kind of gives a sense of what public opinion is like. People have to vote in this contest, and most people thought, the polls all show that he would win by 2 or 3 points. He won by 15. So, and you said you were going to change things. We've given you 3 years, 3.5 years. And inflation's higher than when you took over. Poverty's gone from 27% to 35%. Macri said, well, give me more time. These things take time. And they said, I think it's clear that you haven't been successful, so we're going to try something else. And trying something else means going back to the Peronists, which is the largest party in Argentina, and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who's the vice presidential candidate of the Peronist ticket. So we'll see on October 28th, when there is an actual election, the first round of the election, what the results are. But certainly most analysts and experts believe that this resounding win of 47% to 32% seems to suggest that it's going to be very difficult for those numbers to be reversed. And it's not that people said, well, we love Peronism, or that the former Peronist governments were great. They said, we've tried this, a non-Peronist government, and look at the numbers, and so let's go back, let's try something different. In Mexico, another tsunami, the election of López Obrador, 53% of the vote, unprecedented in Mexico, which has a 6-year term. López Obrador is somebody who's tried to be president for a number of times and won this time. Why? Why did he win? Because Mexicans all of a sudden got up and they said, I think we were more leftist than not. No. Because they had two political parties, the PRI, which is the traditional political party, had been in power for 70 years, and another party called the PAN, which is a conservative, social conservative party, which had been in power for 2 terms, once under a president named Vicente Fox and the other under Felipe Calderón, and they performed terribly. High levels of corruption, record levels of violence, no growth. And so you'd speak to a lot of Mexicans and you say, well, you're really going to vote for López Obrador? He's somebody of the left. He's somebody who wants the state to control the economy. Is that really, you think, the right way to go? They said, well, I don't know, but these people have failed. So we're going to try something else. Now, López Obrador right now has a very high level of popularity. It may not last. There are a lot of concerns about where Mexico is going. But if he fails to deliver to the people who elected him, he's going to also be punished at the polls, as Macri was in Argentina. I was at his inauguration on December 1st of last year, and there was tremendous enthusiasm and symbolism, and what he called ushering in the 4th transformation of Mexico. Really fundamental changes in Mexico. But to have fundamental changes, you need resources. And you can't have no growth and transform a country. And I think that's the main challenge that he has. It may hit him later and he'll make adjustments, but so far he hasn't. Brazil in green over there, largest country, continental country in Latin America. Another shock, the election of Jair Bolsonaro in October, who took office this January. Somebody who doesn't come from the political parties. The centrist candidate in Brazil got 4% of the vote. He's a guy from the extreme right, a nationalist, nativist view. Very small party, but his message of anti-politics and challenging the status quo resonated. He also followed years of rule and governance by the Workers' Party, a party of the left that was led by Lula Fernandez de Silva, one of the most charismatic leaders in recent Latin American history. And there was just an anti-PT vote. Did people vote for Bolsonaro because they embraced his ideology? Well, some did. But the vast majority, I would argue, voted for him because they didn't like the PT and they wanted the Workers' Party, and that was seen as widely corrupt. They had the worst recession in Brazil's modern history under the PT, and so it wasn't totally irrational or unreasonable for people to say, let's try this guy and see what happens. Well, we see what's already happening. There are some things that were positive, the approval of a pension reform, a Social Security reform, but we see massive deforestation of the Amazon, and somebody who doesn't believe at all in climate change, and so there are a lot of things that I think are of great concern. I was in Brazil about a month ago launching the Portuguese version of this book, and certainly a lot of people I talked to were very worried about what would happen under this government. I lived in Peru, here on the left here, below Ecuador, Peru, above Bolivia, for 4 years, from 1987 to 1991. I lived at a time when Peru had hyperinflation, about 7,000% inflation a year, which is pretty high, and a ruthless insurgency you may have heard of called the Shining Path. And I was living at the time. It was a terrible situation, probably besides Venezuela, maybe the worst situation ever in South America in recent history. Political parties in the late 80s were totally discredited. They were widely corrupt. And there was a guy by the name of Alberto Fujimori who 3 months before the election no one had ever heard of. There were books written about this, about people sort of asking people, and all of the great pundits and analysts and journalists said, who is this guy? And he wins the election in 1990 because people were fed up with the traditional political parties. Now, this is 1990. This is not, people talk about that today. We're talking about 1990. This was a while ago. And he was the alternative. And people went for him. They re-elected him in 1995. He brought the economy under control. He also really dealt a severe blow to Shining Path, captured the head of Shining Path in September of 1992, but then presided over a period of very high corruption, of state control, of repression, and human rights violations, and ended up serving, and he's now still in prison, serving a 25-year term for corruption and human rights violations. But again, that was a moment that people, it wasn't because they loved him, they just hated what they had before. And it was a total shock. Living there, nobody had any idea that this was going to happen. And he beat a world-famous novelist named Mario Vargas Llosa, many of you have heard of, in the election, who had all the recognition, resources you could possibly have. Fujimori didn't have any resources, but he won because there was such a deep contempt for the prevailing institutions. And the final example I'll give is the catastrophe that we're seeing today in Venezuela, up there. Hugo Chavez was elected 20 years ago in December of 1998, a little over 20 years ago. He got 56% of the vote of Venezuelans. You ask, why did he get the vote? Why did he get such a high percentage? Why did he win so resoundingly? Well, Venezuela is the only country in all of Latin America. There's a period of the 1980s called the lost decade, when Latin America really didn't grow very much. Venezuela is the only country that had two lost decades. It had the 1980s and the 1990s. It lost 40% of its national income over that period. It had two traditional political parties that got increasingly removed from their constituents, from their base, and were wildly discredited and seen as bankrupt by most Venezuelans, and who were very, very resentful that these parties were ignoring them, weren't taking them into account. And Chavez comes in, populist guy, very charming, very charismatic, and he said, we're going to make a revolution, a Bolivarian revolution, and we're going to bring in the poor, and we're going to give the poor who have been neglected and overlooked what they deserve. And we have an agenda for social justice. That was what Chavez was. Again, people voted in that year, part because they liked his message, but mostly because they were just fed up with what was before. And look at the performance of the government that preceded him. So when you hear about Venezuela, and we all want a democratic change because the suffering and misery is unimaginable, it's not to go back to what existed before Hugo Chavez. It's to create something new and different for the future. So there we are with 5 examples, and I think, you could say left and right, but Chavez was of the left, Lopez Obrador was of the left, Paulson Otto was of the right, Fujimori was of the right. I mean, you can come on any side of the political ideological spectrum, but if their predecessors don't perform, then they're going to be punished at the polls. Let me move a little bit, if I could, to how the current administration in Washington is viewing all this. First, to start, to say that Venezuela is, without question, the highest priority in Washington. If you go to Washington and you speak to people at the White House or the State Department or in Congress, staff members in Congress, and you say, what are you working on? They'll say, 90% of my time's on Venezuela. Now here we have a big, look at South America, all these countries, 90% of the time is on Venezuela. And that is because of the scale and the dimensions of a crisis that, again, we haven't seen before. The inflation rate is in the millions, not in 8,000 like in Peru, is nothing compared to what it is in Venezuela. Tremendous economic crisis, political crisis, humanitarian crisis. Over 4 million people have left Venezuela since 2015. 1.3 million live in neighboring Colombia. There, you see the purple right on the left there, have gone there. In Peru, down there, 900,000 Venezuelans in Peru. Many of them have walked to Peru, by the way. on foot. You could see there are a lot of documentaries about this that show people, and they leave Venezuela because it's simply unbearable, and they walk there. So an incredible humanitarian crisis as we've never seen, tremendously tragic, a real nightmare, and a government that, if there was an opportunity to have a vote, a free and a fair vote, would be voted out, like these other people were voted out, because he has 10 to 12% in the polls. And you have a young leader, an interim, who's recognized as interim president, Juan Guaido, who has 50% in the polls. So if there were an election that were under good conditions, normal conditions, Guaido would beat Maduro. But you have a regime that's not only authoritarian, but is very much sustained by criminal activity, widespread corruption, drug trafficking. It's a point of traffic that goes from Colombia to Venezuela, and then it goes out to Europe and to the United States and elsewhere. So it's a government that doesn't want to give up power. It is not prepared to give up power. So they go after the opposition. They're highly repressive, vast human rights violations. The UN just published a report not too long ago that, if you read it, it really is extraordinary. What the situation is, and the killings and the torture and the like, that was taken from testimonies from people in Venezuela. What to do about this? Well, this was an issue that was high on the agenda with Barack Obama as well. With President Trump, you have a ratcheting up of pressure. Certainly have more rhetoric. There's a lot of references to all options on the table. A more serious consideration of the use of force, of military power. People say, well, we did it in Panama in 1989, or we did it in Grenada in 1983, and let's just get rid of the guy. But that option looks increasingly, I would say, less likely. I think first of all, there's no other government that would support the United States in that. Colombians, who have 1,400,000 Venezuelans who are refugees, absolutely have ruled out any support or participation in any military operation against Venezuela. And they have guerrillas who are based in Venezuela, but still they have said that they will not participate. The rest of Latin America also will not participate. So not to mention Europe, they don't want any part of it. So the United States would be alone, and Venezuela is not Panama. And Grenada didn't even make this map. That's how small it is. So we're talking about a country of 33 million people. We're talking about a country that has 160,000 in the armed forces. Talking of a country that has 2,000 generals. More than we have. So this is not, a Grenada or a Panama, let's go in there and take care of it and leave. This would be a real mess. And it would mean that if any military option, there have been very good articles about this and analysis of this, any military option would mean necessarily an occupation of Venezuela. The U.S. would have to come in and take control, and I'm not sure there's much of an appetite in this country for that, and especially for a president who has talked about withdrawing from the world. I'm not sure sending troops to Venezuela to control it is something that would be widely supported by many people in the United States. What the Trump administration has done is first, they have individual sanctions against those who are accused of drug trafficking and human rights violations. There are also financial sanctions, economic sanctions. And recently there were sanctions put in, a new round of sanctions that some in the media have called an embargo. It's close to an embargo, but not quite an embargo, of freezing all Venezuelan assets in the United States, and also going after third parties that trade and deal with Venezuela. So they're getting tougher and tougher and applying more and more pressure to see what happens. There are talks going on now that are sponsored by Norway. First round took place in Oslo, and then they've been followed in Barbados, which is in the Caribbean, a small island in the Caribbean, that have representatives from Maduro and representatives from Guaido talking about an agreement, seeing how they can get an agreement. The Venezuelans don't like the sanctions. They would like them to be sort of removed, but the opposition says, look, we want free and fair elections. And then the question is, could Maduro preside over those elections? Can he organize them? Could he be a candidate? There are lots of questions that I think where the parties are still far apart, but they're talking. And the Norwegians, as you know, have had some experience and expertise in this. So a lot is going on. Do I think, that we're going to have an agreement and this nightmare is going to end soon? I wish it were, but I have my doubts. I think it's very, very difficult. I think we have lots of factions and divisions within the U.S. government on Venezuela, between the State Department and the National Security Council and others. I think we have in Congress. I think we have divisions in the Maduro government, different factions as well. This is not like Augusto Pinochet, who was the dictator of Chile for 17 years, where he had Pinochet. This is lots of different factions with different interests that have different business operations. The one thing that Chavez did when he was alive, he died in March of 2013 of cancer. Maduro took over, but when he was alive, he gave the military a lot of positions that were very lucrative. So in that way, he ensured their loyalty to him. And that was turned out to be quite shrewd. He was very shrewd, Chavez. So you have these very, very difficult obstacles to really getting up. Now, at some point, it is going to end. I hope it's sooner rather than later, and I hope it's peaceful and not violent. So that is the main focus of a lot of work in Washington. A lot of these people in Congress and elsewhere are looking at the political solution. The second idea is to look at the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and also throughout the region of people that are really having a hard time. And then, unfortunately, at the beginning, when this started a year or so ago, most of the governments were extremely generous and opened their hearts to Venezuelans. Recently, we've seen some signs that are more troubling, that there's some signs of xenophobia, there are signs that these economies are not doing great, Venezuelans are taking their jobs, they accuse them of being part of, responsible for crime and the like. So we're just beginning to see in the last couple of months signs that this is, there's a certain limit. People were at the outset were very generous and very open. Now they're beginning to change. So it's a focus on a political solution, on dealing with this humanitarian problem. And third, what's called the day after. At some point, there is going to be a change. This government is not going to Maduro's not going to be there forever. Once this government leaves, and there's a transition, what happens then? So there are a lot of very intelligent people who are thinking about what do you do about the economy? What do you do about the oil sector? This is the country with the largest oil reserves in the world. The oil sector has been totally, utterly destroyed. How do you rebuild that? How do you rebuild political institutions? It's not a question of making changes in the justice system. It's redoing the justice system. These are things that have been destroyed. They're not damaged, they're completely destroyed. So there are a lot of very capable and smart Venezuelans who are dedicating a lot of time to figuring out what do we do whenever that time comes, and however it comes, what do we do to rebuild our country? And I can tell you that even under the most optimistic scenario, if you all force yourselves to look at the brightest scenario, it's going to be a very, very long haul. It's going to take a long time, even if everything goes well, and even if it happens soon. So all of these people that are leaving and are in Colombia and Brazil and Peru and elsewhere, Venezuelans, are they going to go back to Venezuela? Well, it's not going to change right away. They're not going to have better conditions right away. In the best case, it's going to take a long time. So we have this awful situation that the Trump administration spends a lot of its time talking about and focusing on and trying different things. So far it hasn't worked, but they're still at it. And I think there are different messages from different parts of the government, but to some extent that's normal. But in this case, it seems to be a lot of differences within the U.S. government itself. Now, this is related to the Cuba. We have Cuba up there, right below Miami. For many people in the administration, especially at the National Security Council, what's decided in Caracas, in Venezuela, what happens in Caracas is decided in Havana, the capital of Cuba, and not in Caracas. Cuba has had a very, very close relationship with Venezuela since Chavez came in. Chavez's mentor was Fidel Castro. I don't think there's any argument that they were very, very close. And of course, Chavez presided over this oil boom. Remember the party from 2000, for all those years. And 2003, 2013, he died the year when the party ended. Before that, it was booming. When he came to power, oil was $10 a barrel. In 2009, it was $140 a barrel. If you're the country with the largest oil reserves, that's a pretty nice, you're doing pretty well. You have a lot of money. So, and out of generosity, he sent oil to his friend Fidel, and about 100,000 barrels a day. And Cuba used part of that for local consumption, but sold a lot of that on the market, international market, and that's the way Cuba has sustained itself, one of the ways Cuba has sustained itself. Now that supply has been sharply diminished, about maybe 25, 30,000 barrels a day, which is something, but not what it was. And there is this sense ideologically in Washington that Cuba is really controlling things. Maduro himself had spent a lot of time in Cuba. He travels to Cuba, and so my own view is that some of that tends to be a little overstated. But without doubt, Cuba is important, Venezuela, and there are advisors, security advisors, intelligence advisors. If there's one thing the Cubans are very good at, is survival. They've done it for 60 years. And so if a regime wants to survive and use all the instruments at its disposal, Cuba has the expertise. And they don't want Venezuela to collapse, because if they collapse, they know that they're next. That's the big prize. The United States has had an embargo on Cuba since 1962. If Venezuela goes, then they're in trouble. So there is this long Cuba-Venezuela connection. And it's part of it ideological. I mean, John Bolton, the head of National Security Council, National Security Advisor, talks about the troika of tyranny in our hemisphere, which is Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, a small country there, which is run by Daniel Ortega, who had a revolution in the late 1970s and ruled from 1980 to 1990. He lost an election, now has come back, rules that government, again, very authoritarian, dictatorial. So it's an ideological, but there's also a political aspect of it. You'll see where above Cuba, you have Florida. Florida is a very important state in U.S. elections, and that's where the diaspora of Cubans and Venezuelans are largely concentrated. There are about 200,000 Venezuelans who are living in South Florida. And so being tough on Cuba and being tough on Venezuela are politically make sense if you want to secure that you're going to win Florida in 2020. It's not a guarantee, but certainly there's a lot of resources there and votes as well. And it's no accident that the person who is most prominent and visible in the U.S. Congress on both Venezuela and Cuba is Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from Florida. So there's a political element to all of this. Now I want to move quickly to politics as well, to get more into the politics. Because probably when people see the Trump administration, hear the Trump administration, I think the first thing that many people in Latin America is talking about immigration, Latin Americans coming from Central America through Mexico to the United States. He's talking about trade, renegotiating the NAFTA agreement between Mexico and the United States and Canada. There's a lot of attention there. This is all domestic politics. There was a word that was very popular a few years ago about issues that were called intermestic. Intermestic means you combine the domestic with the international. It's a blend of the two. And there's no region in the world where these are so clear as in Latin America. Immigration, trade, drugs, all of them are domestic issues. They have very important foreign policy consequences, and depending on how they're handled, they can affect our relationship with Latin America. But they're all basically U.S. domestic issues. And Donald Trump came to the White House in 2017 on two issues: immigration and trade. And there's only one country in the world that combined both of those issues, and that's Mexico, with the NAFTA agreement and with, of course, immigration, with people crossing the border and building the wall and restriction. So it's not really about Latin America policy. It's about domestic politics, and it's about his pursuit of another 4 years in the White House. And I think if we understand what's going on in the context of the 2020 presidential campaign, it makes more sense. Drugs is another one. Colombia there in purple is the largest producer of coca in the world. The president of Colombia, Iván Duque, had a very good visit to Washington recently in February, March, and got along with President Trump until he went back to Colombia, and the president said, well, he's not doing enough to stop drugs, and was very critical of him. Again, it's not because he doesn't like Colombia or doesn't like the president. It plays well to be tough on drugs in an election year. We know that in the past, and I don't think we've seen an administration that's been so blatant about this. Now, has this damaged U.S.-Mexican relations, U.S.-Latin American relations? Well, it deepens distrust and deepens resentment. The United States is no longer regarded as a reliable ally. The U.S.-Mexico relationship, as the article that was referred to by Mark in Great Decisions, really went through a tremendously positive evolution since the early 1990s, and now it's been set back considerably because of what's happened. But is there an open confrontation between the Trump administration and Latin America? No. It's very striking that Mexico, this leftist president who just won with 53% of the vote in Mexico, anti-politics, anti-political system, has been very accommodating to the Trump administration. He has told his foreign minister, your instructions are the following: I don't want any fight with President Trump. Avoid anything with confrontation with President Trump. And he's done that. And if you really follow the response in Mexico, at least of the president, who's somebody who considers himself a nationalist and a leftist, he's been very, very quiet and very silent. Because what do you have to gain? If you fight with Trump, what happens? Even Cuba, Raul Castro has been relatively silent about Trump, despite the very punishing policies and measures that have been taken by this administration. Central America. These are governments in Central America that moved their embassies in Israel to Jerusalem, following the U.S. lead and U.S. pressure. And what do they get? Well, they cut off all the aid to those countries until they stop immigrants from leaving those countries and going to the United States. They've threatened to impose, the administration has threatened to impose tariffs. So again, but what are they going to do? They simply do things that try to accommodate him, but the alternative is standing up and defying and having a confrontation, which they don't see any benefit of. Let me just make a point on the final issue, if I could, before we go to our conversation. I get the hard questions from Adrian, which is China. I think this is probably the biggest issue where there's a shift between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Obama administration, China has a tremendous presence in Latin America. It's the largest trading partner of Brazil, Chile, Peru. It's the second largest trading partner of Colombia and Argentina. 3 countries just recently recognized China: Panama, Dominican Republic, and El Salvador. That's the way things are moving. They do tremendous investments in Latin America. We have the dialogue, we have a database that shows they've lent over $120 billion since 2005 to Latin America. They're a tremendous player in the region. And under the Obama administration, the response when you raise China would say, well, we'd like there to be more transparency. We'd like the Chinese to at least be open about what they're doing, and so, we're open about what we're doing, they should be open about what they're doing, and so forth, and that was criticism. In the Trump administration, it's very different. There's a lot of very, very sharp language directed to government saying, this is mercantilist, or predatory country. You're going to get deeper in debt. This is really bad for you, and you really shouldn't deal with China. And you have a choice. You can deal with us or you deal with China. And it's been very, 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 a lot more pressure on these governments. Of course, that has to do with some of the trade war and the like at a global level. But you see it in country after country. U.S. official goes to any trip to Latin America, and they never fail to raise the issue of China with whoever they're talking to, whatever counterpart they're talking to. And there's a difference. Latin Americans don't say, okay, we'll do whatever you want. They depend on China. Peru is a country where China has a tremendous presence and tremendous engagements, lots of investments in mining, lots of trade and the like. And the United States says you shouldn't deal with China. They said, well, we've been dealing with them for 10 years. That's why we have growth, one among the highest growth rates in Latin America. You're not offering anything to us. The United States is not. And so, if all things were the same, we'd prefer to deal with the United States than with China. We'd have a lot more in common. We'd have more trust. But if you're not offering anything, and they're offering to build these great infrastructure projects, which we desperately need in our economy, we understand they're not. We have to be careful, and it's not like we love them, but for practical reasons, they do have the resources, they do want to get involved, and we hope to work something out. So there's been a resistance in the region on that. Even the Central American countries recently, Panama, El Salvador. We have a new president in El Salvador. He said during the campaign that he was anti-China, and then he's changed his tune since he's been president. Well, Bolsonaro of Brazil. Bolsonaro, if you look at his campaign, again, the similarity with Trump was very anti-China, until people told him when he got to be president that, hey, they're our biggest trading partner. They're investing all over the country. A lot of our economy is going to suffer if we break ties with China. China is critical, and now he's completely backtracked after having said that at the beginning that he would be different. So China is a very, very, I think, relevant, important issue where I think, although there have been lots of changes with previous administrations and Trump, in my mind, that is the most striking of all. So China shows that there's, when the InterAmerican Dialogue started in 1982, my organization, no one in their wildest imagination thought that China would be a priority for our organization. We always focused on the United States and decisions that were made in Washington and how they impacted Latin America. And now we have an organization that focuses on decisions also that take place in Beijing and how they impact on Latin America. So we're in a different world, different reality, and a lot of very, very complicated challenges lie ahead. So thank you for your attention, and look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, for that really comprehensive and fantastic overview. I think that the discussion that we just had really shows the depth and breadth of your expertise, and we're going to have a chance to go a little deeper into some of the areas that the rest of you find to be most interesting. And so I believe that they have question cards that are available to all of you. I'd like to ask you to take a few minutes and think about the questions that you want to put towards Michael. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and ask a few questions to get us started. So let me see. You mentioned in the discussion Brazil, and the fact that Brazil is in the final stages of passing a controversial pension reform, and they've now set their sights on tax reform. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you think the prospects are of passing reform in a divided Congress, the political situation that we currently have in Brazil. And also, if you can talk a little bit about how the intense focus on some of these big key reforms has perhaps distracted attention from passing some of the other priority legislation and regulations that the economy needs in order to get going again.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think one thing I should have mentioned, and I'll take advantage of your question to mention it, which is that the pension reform, which looks likely to be approved by the Senate in Brazil and will go through, which I think is important, it's going to happen not because of Bolsonaro, but despite Bolsonaro. The person who really is critical in Brazil these days is the head of Congress, Maia. And I think that he was able to generate support and to show that if Brazil didn't have pension reform, they would be in serious trouble. And it wasn't the leadership from the president that made this happen. So I think that's important to look at. And also something, as you look at other reforms, my guess is that's going to be the same thing. You're not going to get presidential leadership. You have initiative within the Congress itself, and especially the head of Congress, that pushes these things. And I think, as you said, the next reform, is tax reform. Brazil is always, give and take, negotiations, building coalitions, and that really is the skill that's necessary. Bolsonaro has zero experience or zero capacity to do that. But the question is, will the Congress itself kind of make the deals and make the compromises and reach over to pass these reforms? And I think that's serious. I think it's going to be very slow. I think it's going to be very difficult. Some tax reform, I think, could happen. Health reform, I'm not too sure about. But the other thing that I would say to that is that, there is a tendency sometimes to say, well, Brazil is at least passing these reforms, so things are happening, as if all the other stuff about that are concerns about Bolsonaro, about his very hard line, about his anti-environmental, and he was invited to New York City to get an award, and there was a protest, and he had to cancel his trip because people were protesting. I mean, there's a lot of international reaction against Bolsonaro, and you have to, look at both together. Both these reforms, not just in their, just in a very limited sphere, but they're also related to the broader questions of what he does and his position towards the United States. And he's welcome to the White House. He sits with the President of the United States, but he's not welcome to receive an award in New York because there are these massive protests and elsewhere as well. So it's a one thing affects the other, and I think that that's something that we should keep in mind.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead with one more. You mentioned in your remarks the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about the outlook for passing the USMCA, the replacement agreement that was reached in the U.S. Congress. Maybe talk a little bit about what some of the concerns are with the agreement that we're hearing from some of the Democrats. And I'd also be interested in your perspective about how U.S. election dynamics are playing into the debate, and really what's going to happen if we can't get that agreement passed when Congress comes back from recess. What's going to happen to trade between our nations?
Thank you. Well, that's an important, difficult question. The Democrats, many of the Democrats have not exactly been enthusiastic free traders, and the stated reason of concerns for the passage of this are the labor issue. The Mexicans, including the ambassador of Mexico, who you hear from, who when I had lunch with her, she told me she is meeting with Nancy Pelosi quite regularly to make the case that Mexico has really taken very significant steps on labor, and steps that should be agreeable to the Democrats, who may have some reservations about this. And I think Mexicans have a case to make that they have done quite a bit. So Pelosi has listened to them, but I think the main question, this goes to the second part of your question, which is that, the politics, especially as we get closer to the elections, Trump will claim this as, if it's passed, he'll claim this as a victory. I was against NAFTA, I renegotiated NAFTA, and I got it through the Congress. And the last thing in this moment of this very toxic, poisonous environment in Washington is for the Speaker of the House to give President Trump a political victory. It's just the reality. It's not something that that I like, but it just reflects the reality. So I think it's going to be very difficult to do that for that reason. I think it would be Trump would say, I won, I'm a winner, I did this thing, I changed it, I told you I was going to change it, I did change it, and now we went through. Now, what happens if it doesn't go through? Well, there are two things that could happen. One is they go back to the original NAFTA. The other, which is the Minister of the Economy in Mexico, Ursula, who just resigned recently, said at the dialogue, he said the nightmare scenario for Mexico is if the U.S. pulls out of NAFTA. And he says that would be the worst case scenario, that would be just absolutely awful. So that's what we have to look for if it doesn't get through. I hope it does get through. I know it's difficult. I know there are issues. I hope it is passed. If it's not, you either decide to go back to the NAFTA that we had, but that's going to be hard for Trump to do because he said he would change it. Go back to that, or you pull out of NAFTA completely, which he has authority to do, which Mexican economy minister has described as a nightmare for Mexico.
Great. Well, thank you. You guys did a great job with questions. And I'm going to apologize in advance because we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll take a moment and try to group some of these together. While I'm doing that, let me pose the first to you. What is the future of the Northern Triangle in regards to the migration crisis? You mentioned it a little bit during your remarks, but maybe you can talk a little bit more.
Well, the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador is the source of migration now. It's important to note that there's net zero migration from Mexico to the United States, of Mexicans to the United States. This is Central America, and it's mostly the Northern Triangle and others that are going through. And that has been the case for a long time. There are as many Mexicans coming to the United States as going back to the United States. Coming to the United States as going back to Mexico. From the United States. I think the situation, frankly, is quite troubling and pretty grim in the Northern Triangle. It's hard to be very optimistic, and I think this immigration crisis has brought to light the incredibly difficult conditions in which people try to survive in those countries. It's very high levels of violence, among the highest in the world. Economic problems, lack of opportunities, gang violence and the like. And so a lot of people, take the risk. They know that it's risky to migrate, and a lot of things can happen to them, and a lot of have happened to them. A lot of people have died in their attempt to come to the United States, but they weigh that against the option of staying there, which seems that they condemn to a life of misery, and so they're willing to take the risk. Now, there are some signs. There's a new government in El Salvador. It's a new government that just came in, who has come up with new rhetoric that is music to the Trump administration's ears, saying, that we're responsible for all this migration. We haven't done enough. We got to do more, and really being very hard on themselves and which I think is right. I don't think the Trump administration or any U.S. administration is responsible for this, this situation. There are people who are business leaders and political leaders in the region that have not addressed basic questions. And again, as I said about delivering results, they haven't delivered results. People wait around, they see no prospects. And it gets worse because people who do come to the United States, so people have family members, so that perpetuates and drives even more the out-migration. What will be the end game, how this will end? Hopefully the situation will turn around. But if you look at the situation in three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, maybe El Salvador is the case that I think which is somewhat more hopeful. There have been some reductions in violence in El Salvador that have been reported recently. There's a new government who himself is a businessman and a former mayor of the capital. He's come to Washington a few times. People seem to respond well to him. Whether he alone could change things, I don't know. I'm not predicting anything, but at least it offers some glimmer of hope.